Dr. Adrian Holloway looked at Landon Creed and spoke without softening his words. The aortic aneurysm was already leaking, and without surgery, this single father might have only hours remaining. But on the transfer road through a snowstorm, the ambulance was blocked by a limousine that had crashed into a mountain ravine. Inside, a woman was still alive. Against every medical order, Landon tied a rescue rope around his body and stepped over the guardrail. He pulled her up, then collapsed, never knowing the woman he had saved was a billionaire carrying evidence powerful enough to dismantle her own empire. If you believe that kindness shines brightest when time is running out, stay with Landon until the very last moment. The morning Landon Creed reported to Cedar Hollow Regional Airport. The sky above the Rockies had already turned the color of old pewter, and the weather station was tracking a front that would dump 2 feet of snow before nightfall. Landon had worked the maintenance supervisor post for 3 years, long enough to know exactly which systems to check when a storm of this weight was coming. Runway lighting, backup generators, the emergency fuel reserves, and the rescue gear stored in the far hangar in case incoming medical flights needed ground support. He moved through his checklist the way he always moved through everything, methodically, without hurrying, like a man who had learned through hard experience that the moment you started cutting corners on equipment was the moment someone paid for it later. He was 46, broad across the shoulders, despite the old left side injury that had ended his search and rescue career, and he wore the kind of quiet competence that made newer employees follow his lead without being asked. When he crouched to lift a heavy tool crate near the generator bay, something split open inside his chest, not sharply, not like a gunshot, but like a seam tearing slowly under too much pressure, a deep radiating burn that moved from his sternum straight through to the muscles between his shoulder blades. He leaned against the concrete wall and breathed until his vision cleared, and when his junior technician asked what was wrong, Landon said it was a muscle strain, nothing more, and he believed it when he said it. His phone buzzed in his jacket. Emery, reminding him about the college counseling session that evening, the one where they were supposed to go over her aerospace engineering applications together. And Landon promised her he would be home by 6, though his voice had gone lower and quieter than usual, and Emery, who knew every register of her father's voice, asked twice if he was sure. Marcus Doyle arrived at the airport mid-morning to coordinate mountain rescue protocols with the aviation team. Cedar Hollow's road rescue chief had worked alongside Landon years earlier, and he had the particular attentiveness of someone who had once watched a partner push through pain and nearly not come back from it. He took one look at Landon's color and the way Landon was holding himself slightly away from his own body, and he overrode every objection on the spot. The hospital was 12 minutes away. Landon was in the imaging suite within the hour. Dr. Adrian Holloway stood at the light box and traced the scan with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. There was a thoracic aortic aneurysm with evidence of slow dissection, a condition in which the inner wall of the body's main artery had begun to separate, and the danger was not that it might cause problems. The danger was that any significant physical exertion, any sudden spike in blood pressure, could turn a slow leak into a rupture that no local facility had the equipment to address. Cedar Hollow Regional could stabilize him. It could not save him. The surgery required a specialist in Denver, and Adrian said the words that reorganized the entire remaining shape of Landon's day. They were not counting in days anymore. They were counting in hours. Landon absorbed this information in the way he absorbed most hard things. Without visible theatrics, with a long silence that was not numbness but active reckoning. He asked Adrian to clarify the window twice, and Adrian gave him the same answer twice, and then Landon asked to use a phone. He did not tell Emery what the scans had shown. He told her to go to her aunt's house and not drive in the storm, and when she pressed him, he said he was just being careful, which was true, and he kept his voice level enough that she accepted it, though the pause before she said goodbye lasted a beat longer than usual. Dr. Holloway had already begun arranging the transfer to Denver Crown Medical Center. The helicopter fleet was grounded, the fixed-wing aircraft at Cedar Hollow were locked in ice, and the only viable option was an ambulance on the mountain highway before the storm fully closed the passes. Adrian had no intention of sending Landon alone. He packed medications for hemodynamic support, a monitoring unit calibrated to flag the first signs of pressure change, and himself, settling into the rear of the ambulance beside his patient with the settled manner of a man who had made harder decisions than this and was prepared to make harder ones still. He told Landon to lie still and mean it. On the mountain above them, in a private resort lodge that occupied a ridge overlooking the same pass they would need to cross, Genevieve Sterling was ending a phone call with the frustration of a woman who had been managing other people's crises for 20 years and was presently managing one she had caused herself by waiting too long to act. Genevieve was the chief executive of Sterling Crown Medical Systems, a company that operated hospitals, patient transport fleets, research centers, and air ambulance contracts across 4 western states, and she had spent the previous 3 weeks assembling documentation that would blow open an internal fraud she had only fully confirmed 48 hours earlier. The metal briefcase beside her contained copies of every contract, every wire transfer record, every falsified maintenance log, a ledger of systematic theft that named her own chief operating officer as the architect. She had called an emergency board session in Denver specifically to present this evidence and demand Rhett Blackwell's immediate suspension before he could destroy anything further. Rhett Blackwell had spent 20 years constructing a version of himself that Genevieve trusted, measured, dependable, always the one who identified the operational problem before she saw it. What he had actually been doing for the last 4 years was redirecting maintenance budget through shell contractors controlled by family members, substituting substandard components in ambulances, helicopters, and corporate vehicles, and doctoring the digital records so the falsifications would only be detectable by someone who already knew what to look for. When Genevieve told him she was leaving for Denver despite the weather advisory, Rhett argued she should wait until conditions improved. When she declined, he authorized the limousine departure, knowing the vehicle's electronic stability system had flagged an unresolved sensor fault in the previous diagnostic, a fault that had not been corrected because the maintenance contractor responsible for correcting it was one of his own. He told himself the car would simply malfunction enough to delay her arrival. He had been making these calculations for years, deciding what risks were acceptable against what exposure he needed to prevent, and the line between acceptable and catastrophic had become invisible to him by the time he let the car go. The ambulance was 40 minutes into the Denver run when the traffic ahead simply stopped, not a gradual slowdown, but the sudden cessation that means the road ahead has become something other than a road. The guardrail on the outer curve was sheared clean, the broken posts still bright where the metal had bent, and the tire tracks in the fresh snow curved past the barrier and disappeared into the ravine below. Landon raised himself onto one elbow before Adrian could stop him and looked through the side window at the drop. The limousine was not visible from road level. It had gone far enough down to land on a rock shelf, maybe 22 or 23 meters below the guardrail, listing at an angle that meant gravity was still making decisions about where it would end up. The storm had softened the sound, but it had not erased it, and in the quiet between gusts, Landon heard something that most people standing at that guardrail would have dismissed as settling metal: 3 deliberate, evenly spaced impacts against the doorframe. The distress signal used by mountain rescue teams, taut 'cause it carries through wreckage when voice does not. He knew what it meant. He had taught it himself to trainee crews a decade earlier. He lay back down on the stretcher and said nothing for a moment, staring at the ambulance ceiling while the information arranged itself into its true shape. The mountain rescue unit was pinned on the far side of a minor snowslide that had blocked the access road 30 minutes earlier. The equipment was coming, but it was coming slowly, and the shelf the limousine rested on was not stable enough to wait for slow. Marcus arrived in an off-road vehicle within 10 minutes of being called, assessed the situation from the guardrail with the same read as Landon, and delivered the same verdict Adrian had already delivered. Landon was not going over that railing. Marcus had a knee injury from a retrieval 2 weeks prior that took him out of rappel work, and the other first responders on scene were trained for highway medical emergencies, not vertical technical rescue on frozen rock. Landon sat on the ambulance step and listened to Adrian tell him, a second time, that a meaningful rise in blood pressure could complete the dissection before a surgeon ever touched him. And he listened to Marcus inventory the personnel gaps with the candor of a man who respected Landon too much to pretend the situation was manageable without him. Landon said he did not need to reach the bottom of the ravine. He needed to reach the shelf, brace the vehicle, and create an exit point. A controlled, minimal movement operation that the available ropes and the anchor points on the ambulance could support. He said the person in that car also had people waiting for them. Adrian did not have a medical counter-argument to that, only a human one, and human arguments had never been sufficient to stop Landon Creed from doing what he judged necessary. Landon removed the monitoring leads from his chest and handed them to Adrian, who accepted them without speaking. The rope went around Landon's harness in a configuration he had not worn in 6 years, but which his hands assembled from memory, and then he stepped over the bent guardrail and into the air below. The descent was controlled, but the cold was absolute, and the wind moved the rope in lateral arcs that Landon had to compensate for with small adjustments that cost more energy than they should have. Each correction demanding a stabilization the rope anchor above could only partially provide. The shelf was genuine, solid granite under a thin coat of compressed snow, and the limousine had come to rest with its roof against a rocky outcrop that had slowed the final roll and kept it from going deeper. One of the rear doors had buckled inward on impact, the metal folded at a diagonal that suggested a glancing contact with a secondary ledge on the way down. The front section had taken the heavier damage, but the driver's compartment was intact enough that the man inside was dazed and responding, his head turned toward the window with the unfocused look of someone whose brain has not yet processed the distance between where he started and where he ended up. Landon braced the vehicle first, running a secondary line from the limousine frame to the same granite outcrop, and calling the anchor points up to Marcus, with a voice that he kept flat and measured, even though the pressure in his chest had shifted to something that required deliberate management. When he moved to the rear passenger door and pulled it far enough to see inside, the woman looking back at him was pale but alert, and she was holding a metal briefcase across her chest, with the grip of someone who had decided it was leaving with her regardless of the circumstances. Landon told her his name and told her what they were going to do, and she listened without interrupting, which told him she was not in shock. He asked her to release the seatbelt in the sequence he described, and she did it correctly on the first try. Her name, she told him, was Genevieve Sterling. He registered it the way he registered all information at an active rescue scene, as data, not context, and he began working the door with a pry tool from the kit he had carried down. The cold metal of the car frame burned through his gloves as he worked, and the pain in his chest had moved from pressure to something with sharper edges, and his peripheral vision had begun to contract in a way he recognized and did not acknowledge out loud. Genevieve asked him if he was injured. He told her they were almost through. When the door gap was wide enough, He told her to come out feet first and keep her weight low, and she moved with more control than he had any reason to expect. He asked about the driver. She said she would not leave until the driver came out too. He looked at her for one moment, and then he turned back to the front compartment and began the second extraction. Marcus and the first responders handled the rope work from above, and Genevieve went up first, then the driver, shaken, a scalp laceration already clotting in the cold. And Landon waited on the shelf until both of them were over the guardrail before beginning his own ascent. He made it to within 4 meters of the road before his arms stopped cooperating in any meaningful way, and Marcus and 2 others hauled the last of the distance while Landon focused on keeping his breathing slow and his blood pressure from spiking. He got both feet onto the pavement, and then his legs simply declined to continue, and he went down against the guardrail post with a controlled collapse that Adrian reached before he finished falling. The monitoring equipment went back on his chest within 30 seconds. The numbers Adrian read from the display made him close his eyes briefly, and then he opened them and spoke into his radio with the particular velocity of a physician who has just been reminded that time is not abstract. The helicopter had been dispatched from Denver Crown Medical Center the moment the storm window opened, a narrow corridor of reduced wind that the flight team had been watching for since Landon's case was flagged as time-critical. It arrived at the highway scene to collect the CEO of Sterling Crown Medical Systems, whose name was on the tail registration, whose company owned the aircraft, and whose security personnel were already on the ground, insisting on protocol. Genevieve had a fractured rib and a laceration across her left forearm. Landon's dissection had progressed further in the 40 minutes he had spent on the shelf, and Dr. Holloway presented the comparison without editorializing. One patient had injuries that could be managed in a local facility with follow-up. The other patient might not survive the road trip to Denver in an ambulance. The flight coordinator explained that the manifest was registered to the CEO and that substituting passengers required authorization no one on the ground had clearance to provide. Genevieve said that a medical transport system that ranked job titles above clinical urgency was not a system worthy of the name Sterling Crown, and she signed the transfer authorization using Claire Beckett's pen while the security team objected. She handed the metal briefcase to Claire and told her not to let it out of her sight. Then she watched the helicopter lift Landon Creed off the mountain highway while she waited for an ambulance to take her in the opposite direction, standing in the snow with her fractured rib and her coat that had lost 2 buttons in the ravine. Dr. Nathaniel Granger performed the repair at Denver Crown Medical Center in a surgery that lasted just under 6 hours, working through the dissection with the particular precision his specialty demanded, while a team of 4 assisted and an anesthesiologist managed the hemodynamic balance that the whole operation depended on. Emery Creed arrived at the hospital during the surgery. She had driven through the storm to her aunt's house, and then driven back when the truth could no longer be held in a single short phone call. And she sat in the corridor outside the surgical wing in her father's old canvas jacket, which she had taken from the hook by the door that morning without consciously deciding to, the way you take something of a person when you are afraid they might not come back and you need something of them nearby. A nurse updated her at the 2-hour mark and again at 4. And Emery sat with the precision of someone who has learned that movement is not the same thing as control, that the only useful thing you can do when a surgeon has a person you love open on a table is to be exactly where they told you to wait and trust the people doing the work. The surgery was successful. Nathaniel told Emery her father would require an extended recovery and strict activity restrictions, and she nodded and asked 2 intelligent questions about the post-operative protocol that made him take note of her. While Landon remained sedated in the ICU, Rhett Blackwell issued a corporate statement attributing the limousine accident to driver error, releasing the text to 3 news outlets before any official investigation had been opened, naming no specific failure mode, offering no technical data, and mentioning, in the second-to-last paragraph, that the driver had a history of rushed departures against weather advisories. The timing was deliberate. The framing was designed to close the narrative before Claire Beckett's team could open it. Landon emerged from sedation on the second morning. He asked about Genevieve and the driver before he asked anything else, and when he was told both were alive and being treated, he was quiet for a long moment in the way of someone filing a piece of information in permanent storage. He did not ask about the news coverage. Genevieve visited that afternoon, without security personnel and without her usual office gravity. She was wearing a sling for the fractured rib, and she looked like a person who had recently spent time thinking about what she would have lost if the shelf had given way 12 seconds sooner. She thanked him with directness rather than sentiment, and she told him she intended to cover every cost associated with his treatment and recovery, his mortgage, and his daughter's university tuition. Landon told her that the offer was generous and that he would not take it. He said that any person present on that highway with the relevant skills and the physical ability to act should have done the same thing, and he did not want money assigned to a moment that had not been about money. Genevieve had spent 20 years in rooms full of people who negotiated every form of recognition available, and she recognized immediately that Landon was not performing modesty. He was describing an internal logic that was simply not organized around reward, and she respected it enough to stop arguing. She ensured he received the standard patient rights and insurance coverage he was entitled to, no more and no less, and made a note that the distinction mattered to him and that it should matter to her. The news coverage outside the hospital was entering its second cycle, the rotation from breaking news to analysis, and the story of the dying man who saved the billionaire had moved through enough interpretive hands that Rhett's preliminary framing had found traction in certain corners. The question was being asked, by voices that sounded curious rather than hostile, whether Landon Creed might have a history of inserting himself into emergencies, whether the decision to go over the guardrail had been medically authorized, and whether his former career had ended because of judgment issues that this incident perhaps echoed. Landon had a memory he had not yet mentioned to anyone outside the ambulance crew. He had been monitoring the limousine from the moment the ambulance passed the guardrail, and before the car went over the edge, he had seen the rear stabilization indicator cycling through a fault sequence. A specific flash pattern that corresponded to a compromised wheel sensor, the kind of fault that would not prevent a vehicle from moving but would slow the electronic stability response on a slick surface to something functionally useless. He had not said this publicly because he was not an accident investigator, and because the correct venue for that observation was a formal statement to the appropriate authority. Claire Beckett arrived at Denver Crown on the third day with a legal pad, 2 colleagues, and the metal briefcase. She sat with Landon for an hour in the presence of his attending physician and a neutral party from the hospital's patient advocacy office, and she asked him only what he had directly observed. Nothing extrapolated, nothing assumed, nothing that asked him to interpret beyond his own field of knowledge. He described the fault indicator light in the language of someone who had maintained aircraft and vehicles for 2 decades, identifying the component type, the specific fault code pattern, and the mechanical consequence of that fault in icy road conditions. He described the condition of the rear sensor connector when he had braced the vehicle on the shelf. Oxidation consistent with a period of deferred maintenance, not a fresh break. He noted that the maintenance verification sticker in the vehicle bore a date from the previous week. Claire cross-referenced the vehicle identification number against the company's maintenance database and found a signed inspection report placing the car at a certified facility 12 hours before the accident. The technician whose signature appeared on that report told investigators he had not seen the car that week. Digital forensics confirmed the signature had been copied from a previous document. Following the maintenance contractor's business records back through the company structure took Claire's team 4 days and surfaced a network of shell entities that had been billing Sterling Crown for service work not performed across a fleet that included ambulances, air transport helicopters, and corporate vehicles. The budget allocated for that maintenance had been flowing outward for years into accounts connected through intermediaries to members of Rhett Blackwell's extended family. The ambulance that had responded to a brake failure outside Cedar Hollow 18 months earlier, an incident attributed to road conditions and closed without further investigation, had a replacement part number in its service record that matched a substandard component batch purchased through one of those same shell contractors. This was not a small fraud conducted on the margins of a legitimate business. It was a systematic redirection of safety infrastructure budget, and the patients who had ridden in those vehicles had done so without knowing the maintenance they were promised had not happened. Rhett moved to counterattack before the board meeting could be convened. He had obtained Landon's partial medical file through a contact in a third-party insurance processing office, and the document showed that Landon had been advised 8 months earlier by a general practitioner to pursue cardiovascular follow-up after a routine screening flagged a borderline result. Landon had rescheduled that appointment twice due to work and had not completed the full imaging workup, a delay that countless working people with limited time and no alarming symptoms would recognize and understand, though understanding was not the use Rhett intended to make of it. Rhett packaged this as evidence that Landon was a patient who had deliberately ignored known risk factors, then placed himself in a dangerous situation to manufacture a heroic narrative that would generate a personal injury claim against Sterling Crown. The story appeared in 3 business news outlets under bylines that did not disclose the source of the medical information. Emery was approached by a journalist outside her school, a quiet ambush that lasted approximately 4 minutes before a teacher intervened, and she called her father from the parking lot in the particular voice she used when she was angry and trying not to let it flatten her. Landon, still in his hospital bed, told Emery the truth about what he had done and why, and he told her that he understood if she was frightened by what people were saying, and she told him she was not frightened by that. She was frightened by the 3 days when she did not know if he was going to come out of surgery. She was not frightened by people who had a reason to lie about him. Genevieve directed her legal and compliance teams to determine how Rhett had obtained Landon's private health records, and Claire identified the access point within 48 hours. A member of Rhett's administrative staff had queried Landon's file through a hospital data portal used for insurance coordination, accessed without clinical justification, and the document had been forwarded to an external communications consultant employed by Rhett's network. The access log, the forwarding record, and the consultant's contract created a clean evidentiary line. Landon told Genevieve he did not want to become the symbol of this story. He asked her to focus the investigation on the patient transport system, because the patients who had ridden in those vehicles were the actual injured parties, and they did not have a legal team or a board of directors or a metal briefcase full of documentation. Genevieve sat with that for a long moment and then said he was right, and she made 4 phone calls, and the framing of the investigation changed. Margaret Winthrop called for a vote to temporarily suspend Genevieve's executive authority on the grounds that her personal connection to the rescue incident created an irreparable conflict of interest in any proceeding related to the accident. The motion had the backing of 3 board members who were less concerned with the outcome than with managing the optics of a public scandal during a period of market sensitivity, which was an understandable instinct and a deeply insufficient one. The board convened in Denver, and because the vote concerned her own position, Genevieve was absent from that portion of the session. Rhett presented his case with the practiced authority of a man who had spent 20 years being believed in conference rooms, and the shape of his argument was elegant enough. Landon Creed was an emotionally compelling figure whom the CEO had become personally indebted to, and that personal debt had clouded her judgment about the accident's origin, the investigation's scope, and her own fitness to lead the inquiry. He described the patient transport irregularities as the kind of administrative error that occurs in any large fleet operation, addressable through standard remediation without the crisis framing Genevieve had introduced. He did not know about the access log. He did not know Claire had traced the full financial network. He did not know that the technician whose signature had been copied had signed a formal statement 2 days earlier. Landon appeared via video link. Hospital staff had set up a tablet on an IV stand and angled it toward the wall screen, and he addressed the board in the voice of a person who understood exactly how much credibility he had and intended to use only as much as was warranted. He described his observations from the rescue scene with precision and identified, clearly, which portions represented direct technical observation and which portions represented inference he was not qualified to draw. He made no appeal to sympathy, offered no narrative about what he had risked, and did not mention Emory. Dr. Granger confirmed that a patient whose aortic dissection had progressed to the level Landon's had reached was physically incapable of coordinating a staged rescue for personal benefit. The clinical reality of his condition at the time made the fraud hypothesis medically incoherent. Claire presented the maintenance records, the financial transfers, the copied signature, the access log, and the communications trail in sequence, building the case the way a structure is built: foundation first, then load-bearing walls, then the roof that completes the enclosure. Margaret asked Genevieve, when she returned to the room for the final portion of the session, why she had transferred the helicopter authorization to Landon on the mountain. Genevieve said the decision was based on clinical triage. One patient had injuries manageable at a regional facility. The other patient faced imminent death. The transfer of the helicopter authorization was not an act of personal gratitude. It was the only medically defensible decision available, and she would have made it for any patient in the same situation, regardless of whether she knew their name. The board voted to suspend Rhett Blackwell and to dismiss the motion against Genevieve. The audit of the transport fleet began the following morning. The audit took 11 days and covered 217 vehicles and aircraft. What it found was not the isolated corruption of a single dishonest contractor, but the accumulated consequence of a philosophy that treated safety maintenance as a cost center rather than a commitment. A philosophy that one ambitious and greedy man had been able to weaponize because the oversight mechanisms designed to catch it had been allowed to atrophy. The financial consultants who briefed Genevieve on the remediation options spent 40 minutes explaining how the company could address the most critical vehicles immediately and manage the public disclosure of the broader findings in a phased sequence that would limit market disruption. Landon had been transferred to a step-down unit by this point and was participating in brief daily consultations at Genevieve's request, purely in the capacity of someone who had worked around vehicle and aircraft maintenance systems for 2 decades and could help the technical team understand which failure modes were most dangerous in mountain transport conditions. He told the consultants, when they finished their presentation, that he had seen many accidents that started with someone deciding a known problem could be managed quietly for one more day. He did not say it with judgment. He said it as a statement of observed fact, the way a structural engineer notes which load patterns precede collapse. Genevieve ordered the immediate suspension of all transport vehicles and aircraft without verified clean maintenance records, contracted third-party providers to cover patient transport while the fleet was being checked, and directed Claire to prepare a full public disclosure that acknowledged the scope of the fraud, the company's failure to detect it, and the remediation plan in complete detail. Sterling Crown accepted regulatory investigation, established a compensation fund for patients and families who had been affected by compromised transport vehicles, and submitted to an external oversight structure that would review maintenance records before any vehicle returned to service. Rhett Blackwell was terminated and referred to federal prosecutors on charges covering fraud, embezzlement, and unauthorized access to protected health information. No cameras captured his departure from the company's offices. The legal process was quiet and thorough and did not require a dramatic scene to be meaningful. Genevieve retained the chief executive position because the board determined that the transparent handling of a crisis she had not created and had actively worked to surface was more indicative of fitness to lead than the crisis itself was indicative of failure. She asked Landon, once he had been cleared to leave the hospital, if he would consider joining the newly established Independent Safety Advisory Board that would oversee Sterling Crown's transport operations. He told her the title should mean something, not just sound good in a press release. He accepted the role under two conditions: that the board reported directly to an independent regulatory body rather than to management, and that his participation begin only after his medical recovery was complete and he had discussed it with Emery. Genevieve accepted both conditions without negotiation. 12 months later, Cedar Hollow looked the way mountain towns look after a hard winter gives way to a summer that makes you understand why people stay. Blue sky from ridge to ridge, air that smelled like pine sap and cold water, the kind of morning that asks nothing of you. Landon arrived at the airport in the same truck he had driven the day Marcus brought him to the hospital, and he walked the same route through the maintenance bay that he had walked on the morning before everything changed, except that he walked it differently now, with the particular attention of someone who had been reminded of exactly what all of this was for. His cardiac recovery had progressed ahead of the surgical team's initial projections, and his return to work was limited to supervisory and training functions, which suited him. He had spent the winter months building a curriculum for maintenance personnel who would work on mountain medical transport vehicles, material that combined his aviation background with the specific mechanical conditions of high-altitude winter operations, and the first cohort of trainees had completed the course the previous month. Sterling Crown had replaced its entire mountain transport fleet with new vehicles, fitted each one with tamper-evident maintenance logging systems that required multiple sign-offs before any record could be altered, and made the maintenance data publicly accessible on a quarterly basis. A structural change designed to make what Rhett had done impossible rather than simply illegal. Genevieve drove to Cedar Hollow on the morning of the new rescue center's dedication in a standard rental car with Claire in the passenger seat, a deliberate choice that registered with everyone who noticed it, and she walked into the building the way people walk into places where something real happened, which is to say carefully and without display. Emery appeared at the ceremony in the blue dress she had worn to accept her aerospace engineering scholarship from a regional aviation foundation, not a gift from Genevieve Sterling, a point Genevieve had been careful to honor. And the scholarship letter was in Landon's jacket pocket because he had been carrying it since the day it arrived. The ceremony was modest. A brief address from the county emergency coordinator, remarks from Marcus Doyle about what the facility would mean for mountain rescue operations, and a short statement from Landon that covered the technical mission and thanked the people who had made it possible, and did not make reference to any of the events that had led to it, because the building was not a monument to those events. It was a working rescue center, and he intended for it to function as one. After the ceremony, when most of the attendees had moved toward the reception area, Genevieve found Landon standing in front of the display case near the entrance. Inside the case was a clock, the dashboard clock from the limousine, recovered from the ravine during the vehicle removal operation. Its face cracked, and its hands stopped at the exact time Landon had gone over the guardrail. Below it was a small card in plain text. Time does not tell you how long a person has left to live. It tells you what they chose to do with what they had. Genevieve asked him if he had ever regretted stepping over that guardrail. Landon looked at the clock for a moment before he answered. He said he had been afraid, on the shelf, and during the ascent and in the minutes before the sedation took him under in the surgical suite, that he would not get to see Emery finish becoming the person she was clearly going to be. He said that was a real fear, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said that if he stood at that guardrail again tomorrow, with the same information he'd had then, a person alive below, a signal he recognized, skills that applied, he could not stand still. He did not think that made him heroic. He thought it made him someone who understood what skills were for. Genevieve told him he had saved her twice, once from the shelf, and once from becoming the kind of executive who had forgotten that the numbers in the quarterly report were connected to actual people on actual mountain roads in actual emergencies. Landon said she had also saved him, that the helicopter transfer had been the difference between surgery and a road that closed before the ambulance got through, and that no one in this story had made it through alone. They stood there for a moment in the quiet of the building before the sound of the reception, and the mountains beyond it came back in, and then Emery appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the direct practicality of a person who had decided the sentimental portion of the morning had run its appropriate length. She handed 1 cup to her father and nodded to Genevieve in the easy way of someone who has grown up watching a parent navigate complicated situations with grace and has quietly absorbed the method. Landon and Emery left the rescue center together in the early afternoon under a sky that had no weather in it. Clean and wide and unhurried, the kind of sky that makes the ground beneath it feel like a place where the future is still being written. A year ago, Landon Creed had been told he might have hours. He had spent those hours on a rope over a frozen ravine, pulling a stranger toward daylight. He had woken up to a world that was still turning, still asking things of him, still full of his daughter and the mountains and the work that needed doing, and every day since had not been borrowed time or a second chance or any of the phrases people reach for when they want to frame survival as exceptional. Every day had simply been the next one, which was more than enough, and more than he had expected, and exactly what he intended to use.